I love that tune. Thank you. That's very worthy of an amen. Thank you, David, for reading that very poignant passage. It's near the end of Paul's writings to Timothy, and he's being very reflective about his life, his ministry, and his calling, even as he knows that the time is near an end for him in prison. As for me, I'm already being poured out as a libation. The time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. That is the faith that we are reflecting upon today. Now, if you've read a lot about Paul and a lot from Paul, the first thing that crosses our minds about the Apostle Paul is usually not humility. And that's probably due to the fact that, well, as Saul the Pharisee, he took it upon himself in his religious zeal to go out after the Jesus believers and to have them rounded up, arrested, punished. And so that's why he was riding toward Damascus when he's knocked off his horse by this blinding vision of Jesus, which confirmed his apostleship, that he had seen the risen Lord. And the vision of Jesus says, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Paul converted to faith. Well, wouldn't you, if you were knocked off your horse by a vision of Jesus? I think so. But no humble pie yet for Paul. Because even after he had written letters and he had established churches, still the Apostle Paul in his writings kept reminding us that he had been a sterling first-class Pharisee, that he was very well educated in the classics, that he was quite religiously observant of the law of Moses. Oh yes, he was a Roman citizen. But even so, with all the credentials, Paul had come to realize that God alone is amazingly, mysteriously, unfathomably, and infinitely awesome. Beyond anything or anyone that his limited mind could imagine. The unspeakable, the unknowable, divine, that belonged, confined perhaps to the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, cue Raiders of the Lost Ark music. Da 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 da. Right? Okay, now that's where we learn a lot of our theology these days. Or the temple's Holy of Holies, King of Kings soundtrack. Well, that awesome, infinite God became known in that moment to Paul. And for him, that was truly humbling, infinitely humbling. A healthy dose of humble pie was certainly on the menu. And wow, since we live only one block away from the Hubbard Avenue Diner with its incredible pies, I'm already getting hungry. We're going to have to stop by there, honoree. But that will have to wait. You know, Jesus also revealed the need for humble pie. Now, Jesus did it by telling parables, by telling stories that captured the imagination, that engaged the ethical behaviors, and sometimes even enraged the ears of those who heard and listened. He did this sometimes even with some blatant stereotypes. Of course, I would never engage in such stereotypes, except for maybe one story. There was, of course, once a Hindu priest, a Jewish rabbi, and a Presbyterian minister who were caught in the same area in a terrible rainstorm, thunderstorm, lightning storm. And so they sought shelter at a nearby farmhouse. Well, the farmer said to them, "That storm will be raging for hours. You'd better stay here for the night." The problem is, there's only room enough for 2 of you, so one of you will have to sleep in the barn. Well, the Hindu priest immediately said, I will be the one. A little hardship is nothing to me. And so the Hindu priest went out to the barn. But a few minutes later, there was a knock on the door, and it was the Hindu priest. And he said, I'm so sorry, but there is a cow in the barn. And according to my religion, cows are sacred and one must not intrude into their space. But don't worry, said the rabbi. Come on in. I'll go sleep out in the barn. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the door. It was the rabbi. I hate to be a bother, he said, but there is a pig in the barn. In my religion, pigs are considered unclean, so I would feel uncomfortable with my sleeping quarters near a pig. All right, said the Presbyterian minister, I'll go sleep in the barn. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door. It was the cow and the pig. Of course, I would never stereotype anyone like that. Of course, you can translate that to anything, politicians, lawyers, golfers. Sorry, Dave. Anyone. But would Jesus ever tell a story like this? Well, Jesus also told a parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One, a Pharisee, and the other, a tax collector. People are listening. All right, a story from Jesus. Yeah. They all knew how this one was going to come out, since the super pious and the super rich were thought in their culture to be rewarded by God with riches and power and piety. And the poor and the horrible sinners like this tax collector were, of course, cursed by God. The Pharisee, standing by himself and was praying thus, God, I thank thee that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. The people were whispering, see, he's rich, he's powerful, he's pious, since he tells us he's pious. So he obviously must be blessed by God with these things, because God also must think that he is righteous. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and was saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Boo, tax collector. Oh, thief, traitor. General, not so great guy. God thinks you are awful, just awful. And Jesus is going to say that you're soon going to get yours. Of course, by now, everyone's listening intently to Jesus tell this familiar scenario, and they're nodding their heads because they know the punchline is soon going to come, and it's going to be something like this. Well, the tax collector was grabbed by the onlookers and was thrown out into the street. Since, you see, tax collectors in those days were Jewish collaborators with the Roman Empire who would take more than they were supposed to take from people in taxes, which had to also be paid with the hated Roman coins that had this blasphemous image of Caesar on the coin, who claimed to be, yes, a god. And the tax collector would then keep the excess that he collected, thus becoming wealthy with corrupt gain. No wonder he was claiming to be a sinner, because he was the worst, the most hated, the most undeserving person to receive mercy from God. On the other hand, there's this Pharisee, and he's squeaky clean. He gives a tithe of everything, not just the first fruits, of everything. And he's standing it says in the middle of everyone, but he's by himself. He's standing by himself, where he can be heard and he can be seen and he can share with everyone how exceptionally pious he is, that he fasts twice a week, which is really going beyond the expected fasting. Wow, what a guy, what a guy. We're ready to applaud this Pharisee. Great story, Jesus. Now, give us the expected punchline. Put that sinner in his place, cast him out, make him pay. I tell you, this man went to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. What? What? You're commending this sinner? You're affirming and justifying this guy who won't even stand up boldly and proudly before God? Why? When this pious man has just told us how truly pious he is. And that seems to be absolutely true. He's told us how pious, deserving he is. He's not speaking with God. He's probably not even going to the temple with the intention of actually communing spiritually with God. Jesus says he's not justified, but perhaps because he wasn't looking to be forgiven or restored or even to receive mercy. But what about the tax collector? After all, he's a tax collector. He acknowledges that he's a sinner. The great 18th century preacher Charles Spurgeon once said something that really touches my heart. He wrote, "Only that prayer which comes from our heart can get to God's heart. You can draw near to God even though you cannot say a word. A prayer may be crystallized in a tear." A tear, he wrote, a tear is enough water to float a desire to God. So maybe humility, maybe spiritual humble pie, if you will, it's not so much about being in a perpetual state of penitence, but it's in realizing that you indeed are standing or kneeling or cowering in the actual presence of the holy. A realization that becomes the tear that floats to God. There's another parable that I would share with you. This is a real-life parable story. It speaks of the kind of encounter with an awesome God and what that deep humility can do following that encounter with God. There's a man named John Canuso who once made an emotional and grief-driven deal with God. His 9-year-old daughter, Babe, had just been diagnosed in Philadelphia with leukemia. And as John knelt at her bed, he prayed a devout, a humble, silent prayer that he recalls as this: "Dear God, if you would save my daughter, I would be committed to whatever you would want me to do. Just show me the way." In the time that followed, in a way that absolutely astounded everyone, his daughter Babe came to survive the condition, even though she received horrible treatments for it. Ultimately, Babe grew up to adulthood, and she married, and she had children that no one thought she would ever be able to have, given all the radiation and the treatments she had received. John felt that his prayer had been answered when he first prayed it, and he kept his promise, because you see, John was a builder, a successful builder in southern New Jersey. In 1974, the year that his daughter became ill, he reached into his own pocket and he renovated and he furnished a dilapidated Philadelphia home not far from the hospital. And that home became the very first of the world's Ronald McDonald houses. It was a place where families could stay with their children while they were being treated at Children's Hospital. John prayed, "Thank you, Lord. I'm glad you asked me to do something in my own profession." Because helping others was John's way of saying thank you. Soon afterwards, John Canuso started a foundation, and they raffled off houses that they fixed up, and they hosted dinners and auctions. And in the years since that, with the help of family and fellow builders, and with capturing the imagination of, surprise, the McDonald's Corporation, John's foundation has raised over $2 million for leukemia research at Children's Hospital in Philadelphia. It's provided 61 partial scholarships at Villanova given to students who as children had suffered greatly from the effects of childhood cancer. In all the years since Babe's illness and treatment, John has discovered so much more blessing than he ever expected or imagined in his life. And he continues to receive letters that thank him so deeply for all he's done for parents of ill children, relatives of the children, from doctors and staff at Children's Hospital. I could go on about this story, but if you really, really want a huge dose of humble pie, just log on to canusofoundation.org. It's spelled just like it sounds, canusofoundation.org. And I guarantee you'll be inspired. But friends, this is more than a feel-good story. This is a prime example that even when we're feeling that we're broken, when we're down on our knees in desperation, when we feel hopeless and lost, even without a clue which direction to go, and yet we can let the tears of our heart focus on that infinite greatness of God. And the tears of our encounter with God can flow from our hearts to the heart of God. It's then, like this tax collector, that we find justification in God's eyes. And just to be clear, in Hebrew, justification, being just doesn't mean that you're being excused or never mind or just ignore reality. Because for the Hebrews, justification, as Jesus meant it and taught it, is the same thing as righteousness. And righteousness means being right with God. Whatever has preceded it, it means you're right with God in the here and now. Made right, put on a new path, given a powerful love on which you can stand firm, you can stand tall, or simply you can stand up in your hearts as a beloved child of God. Now that's humble pie that makes us whole and good. Ooh, I said pie again. Oh, okay, well, Honoree and I will have to go and get some of that famous pie. I'm getting too hungry to continue preaching. But friends, let's just take some time this week to thank our awesome, infinite, unfathomable God for loving us for who we are and for giving us, whenever we're able to swallow it, a piece of spiritual humble pie that sees God, that loves God, that accepts being right with God. That's what Jesus tells us. And that's what the Apostle Paul writes to us. Let us be in prayer. Most holy God, help us to eat the kind of spiritual humble pie that allows us to be honest with ourselves about whatever helping or hindering, whatever upbuilding or detracting we may have done in our lives to this point. And then for us to let go of whatever it is that holds us back from accepting your grace, your word, your love, your acceptance, your forgiveness, your power, your amazing gifts into our lives. Awesome God, be the peace to us that brings peace to our hearts. Amen.